Welcome to the live stream of a left perspective on the West's defeat in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties earlier on, so this is now a recorded version of the forum which has now happened. The forum featured Riz Wakil, former Hazara refugee, Malik Mia, Green Left US correspondent, Farooq Tariq, veteran Pakistan socialist, Sue Bolton, Socialist Alliance councillor in Moreland. The meeting begins with Chairperson Pip Hinman reading a solidarity statement from the Solidarity Party of Afghanistan. Please, I hope you appreciate the forum, and we'd love to hear your feedback.
At our request that I'd like to read out. It's reasonably short, so bear with me. So this is from the Solidarity Party of Afghanistan. The occupying US government has once again exposed its filthy and inhuman nature to the world. In 2001, this criminal government, in collusion with other NATO imperialists, occupied Afghanistan under the guise of fighting terrorism, democracy, women's rights, and overthrew the Taliban's medieval regime within a few days, replacing them with their jihadist brothers known as the Northern Alliance. However, after 20 years of bloodshed and the killing of hundreds of thousands of our compatriots, today, with the help of a traitor named Zalmi Khalilzad, today, the US government has gifted our country to its long-time walking stick, the Taliban, and handed Afghanistan over to drug lords and other terrorist organisations. Contrary to the US government's Afghans' minions' claims about the achievements of the last 20 years, the Solidarity Party of Afghanistan says that achievements were so fragile they collapsed in a single day once the US troops left. It's clear to everyone that US imperialism never gives its puppet governments enough ground to gain a foothold among the people, which could then lead to a chance of insurrection. As a result, the 20-year Karzai Ghani government, composed of warlords, criminals and thieves, became so corrupt and so hated that it paved the way for the Taliban to take over. No one supported the government except a handful of rented mouthpieces. Now both foreign masters and the mercenary Taliban are stuck in a vacuum. The Pentagon has been surprised by the evacuation of US embassy staff and their Afghan aides. Taliban insurgents in Qatar are also unable to help form their future government in Afghanistan. It should be noted that imperialism has no permanent friends or enemies and is only concerned with its own strategic interests. It is therefore not surprising that both the Taliban and the US government provide security for each other. If the Taliban jihad was not just against our people, why are 6,000 US troops currently stationed at Kabul airport? Let us remember that in the near future, the puppet elements, jihadists, technocrats, or Taliban will share a single bone because they share the same nature. With the rule of the medieval Taliban regime, our people will experience a new dark and catastrophic chapter. Although they're pretending to be different, the Taliban's actions throughout Afghanistan show they are the same misogynist, anti-freedom savages. Wherever there is oppression, there is resistance, however. Now that we are under the laws of the bloodiest kind of reactionary force, it's our historic duty to continue our struggle and resistance at every possible level. There is no other way but to continue resisting with new methods. Those who have a steely commitment to freedom, justice, and true democracy can mobilise the people and fight against traitors, even in the most bloody and oppressive circumstances. We fully believe that the progressive anti-Taliban and anti-foreigner movement will rise up in our country and that we will play a decisive role in the struggle. From the Solidarity Party of Afghanistan. Okay, I would like to introduce our first speaker. I'm hoping that he's been able to join us, and that is Malik Mia. Malik is a long-term United States-based revolutionary socialist, and he's going to focus on the Joe Biden government's decision to withdraw, the political debate and the fallout and its meaning. Malik, as many of you would also know, is a regular correspondent for Green Left on politics in the United States. So I'd like to hand it over to Malik. Malik, are you there? No? Rightio. We'll wait for Malik. We'll go then to Farouk Tariq, our second, who's was to be our second speaker, will be our first speaker. Farouk Tariq is a long-time socialist activist and author, and he's going to provide some history of religious fundamentalism and look at the so-called reinvented Taliban regime and its impact on the region. Farouk is the General Secretary, Pakistan Kisan Rabita Committee, and member of the Haqq Khalq movement, the People's Rights Movement. So I'll hand it over to you, Farouk. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Pip, and thank you, Green Left and Socialist Alliance, for organizing this timely webinar. And I could see some of my friends, old friends. Riz Vakil is here. I met him earlier in Melbourne, and so are many other friends. So good that I could visit some of my friends on Zoom as well. Sue Bolton has just joined as well. Hello, Sue. Sue, congratulations on your victory. Okay, so I would like to begin with the present situation which is impacting Pakistan, and that is the suicidal attack which has killed over 100, including US Marine, and wounded many dozens as well. And this has opened a new chapter in the ongoing struggle of the different factions of religious fundamentalists. And this expresses the situation that peace will be far ahead. And those who are talking about handing over power peacefully to Taliban and were talking about engagement all the time with Taliban, and who are thinking that we could work along as we have worked along other dictatorial and different regimes. So we could also do the same with the present Taliban government. But now we see that not so many US Marine has been killed in recent history as has been killed in this attack, where Taliban are blaming the US imperialism that this was the area controlled by you, and US is sharing the responsibility on Taliban. So we see that this is a new situation which has erupted the whole arrangements of the Western powers to evacuate and the US to leave peacefully, and also that Taliban are not homogeneous group. They have different factions and they will act as this is. And as we said earlier, that Taliban victory would enhance the power of the religious fundamentalist. And that we have seen with this new wave of euphoria among the religious fanatics has been witnessed also in Pakistan. Now, Pakistani, there is a government of Imran Khan, and you might all know about to him from cricket, but we know him from his politics, dirty politics he's doing for the last three years, and he's in power. It's a right-wing conservative government which has been glorifying Taliban, not just now after their victory, but for a long time. And they have been the initiators of this so-called Doha negotiation. They had arrested Mullah Brother in 2010, and then they released him in 2018 to help in the negotiation of Doha. And Doha was a method, a strategy by the US imperialism to leave Afghanistan, but they had not seen the outcome of this Doha talk, because it has given momentum to the ongoing occupation of Taliban in Afghanistan. It has discouraged Ashraf Ghani and its government, and we know it for sure that Trump, when he announced these negotiations in July 2018, he went overhead of the of Ashraf Ghani administration in Afghanistan, and they were not really part of these, and it was a direct contact with Taliban, and Taliban got encouraged and they forced US imperialism to put pressure on Ghani administration to release 5,000 Taliban, which are now part of the whole occupant forces. So we have always been opposing negotiation with these so-called new fascist trends, Taliban's fundamentalists, and we have gone through experiences in Pakistan. After 9/11, fundamentalists were really taking over several parts of Pakistan, and they were able to form a government in KPK, which is the province next to Afghanistan, from 2002 to 2008. And this was the time when Taliban were flourished all over, also in Afghanistan. Daesh had made its inroads in different Muslim countries, and the refuge and the encouragement came from this part of Pakistan, which was controlled by religious MMA, which was an alliance of religious party at the time. So we see that during the 20 years, it was the bourgeois government and the military dictatorships who, not understanding the real nature of religious fundamentalism, they tried different strategies. They opted for military operation, they went into negotiation, they helped them by capital and arms in a mishope that they could curtail, they could contain the influence of fundamentalism. But we have seen that this has not worked. So in Pakistan particularly, Swat area of KPK was almost taken over by the fundamentalists, and they were only 70 kilometers away from Islamabad, and then the military came into action. And this was the time. Before this, most of the political parties, including People's Party, Tehreek-e-Insaf, Muslim League Nawaz, Awami National Party, apart from us, who were at that time Awami Workers' Party, they were in favor of negotiation with the Taliban. And they openly said, we have to engage with them. And they went into negotiation. And the mullahs got the permission of the government to implement Sharia in parts of Pakistan, even when there was military dictatorship when there was a government of Benazir Bhutto, which is known as so-called secular politician. Unfortunately, this was the government of Zardari, her husband. Benazir had gone already, and he went along with this. So we have seen the outcome of the negotiation in practical term in Pakistan as well. The negotiation would always benefit the most reactionary element, the fundamentalist. It will help develop their contacts. It will give them credibility. Their credential as a political force would be enhanced. And we have seen with several other groups in Pakistan, religious fanatic groups, whenever the government is involved, they got strengthened. And I also like to say that part of the Pakistani military establishment has helped develop fundamentalism, not only in Pakistan, but also in Afghanistan. And they have been glorifying them, that they are simple cloth wearing people. They are the people who are easy to deal with, and they are strong people. They will help develop overall this passage. And the whole purpose and motivation behind these fundamentalist strong government since 1996, when Taliban came into power, was the gas pipelines. One coming from Russia, one coming from Turkmenistan, and one coming from Iran. So they were mainly interested that they should have a safe passage through Afghanistan. So there was economic motivation behind this propping up of religious fundamentalism in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan. I would also like to say that after a Taliban recent takeover, Pakistan used this to discredit India. And they said, this is a defeat of India. This is a defeat because they were close friend of Ashraf Ghani. And Indians said that it is Pakistani government establishment which has helped Taliban to come into power. So they must be boycotted. So they try to isolate Pakistan. And it is correct that part of the establishment might have helped the Taliban, but the state as a whole, never in words they would support them. In words I'm not talking about in practice, but in words they have always have to say, no, we are against fundamentalism, we are partner in war on terror, and we would like these fundamentalists to go away and so on. So, but this incident, this brutal occupation of Taliban, which is littered with bloodshed, with abduction, with killings, it's not a peaceful takeover. We have seen 20 years of suicidal attacks, 66,000 Taliban, the Afghan people have lost their lives. And we have all the sympathies and solidarity with those families who lost their life. Thousands and thousands has to be evacuated, displaced internally and externally. So we see the method and strategies used by Taliban were terrorism. So it's not a power which we can deal with. We have to oppose it. We have to demand, don't accept this government as a legitimate representative of the Afghan people. And this has accelerated fundamentalism in Pakistan. I just like to say in few words, a comparison between Iranian fundamentalist government and the Afghani fundamentalist government. Now, Iranian government, when they came into power in 79, they came on the shoulders of the masses. It was a united struggle of the Iranian people to overthrow the corrupt regime of Shah at the time. Unfortunately, the Communist Toda party sided with Khomeini forces. And when they came into power, they were on the airport to welcome Khomeini, but within 1 month, most of the leaders, including Nuruddin and all other, were assassinated by fundamentalists, and they tried to strengthen their government by killing every opposition at the time. But I don't think there will be like occupations of American embassies like after the Iranian Revolution. It will not be like that. It will be more like it's a government of Taliban who came into power by gun, not by people's power. And they say we are the majority. So we have to see that if they are in majority, because gun can dictate many things. But when you give them an independent option, then we will see the real position. So I don't think, like Iranian regime, which has lasted 41 years, this regime would last that long, but it's not going to end in immediate future. We see resistance in Afghanistan. We see people's hatredness towards this, but to see that it will be overthrown immediately is very difficult option. They will do their most fascist tactics to curb any voices which challenge their power in Afghanistan. And they will show their real face when a mass resistance will emerge. And even before that, they will show their real August. Maybe after 31st August, we will see who these Talibans are. And so finally, I would say, yes, we are going through a difficult time. It's a bad time for the progressive forces internationally. What we need is much more solidarity, and we need to unite to help the Afghan refugees. We are in process of evacuating some of them, but we are not in a position to evacuate in a bigger manner. But whatever we could do from Pakistan, we have held meetings And we welcome Afghan refugees who could not live under Taliban regime. And we will demand that those who want to leave Afghanistan, they should be allowed to leave Afghanistan. So helping, developing, and working along with Afghan refugee is one of our main tasks, and also helping, developing those forces living inside Afghanistan and opposing Taliban. And we know people who are there and they want to fight back. And our daily paper online, which is printed online, the Jidojahd, the struggle online, is printing daily reports from Kabul in Urdu language. And we are trying to side with those who are inside, mainly women. Women are the most bravest part of the resistance. The woman, the 7 women who demonstrated the first demonstration in front of the presidential palace. We interviewed the leader of that, who is a young woman. They were all from 20 to 25 years, and they have an abrupt, brave demonstration in front of the presidential palace in Kabul. And they said Taliban took away their mobile phones, and they were pushing them, kicking them. When the international media came, they went back, and the images that Taliban has allowed this demo, but this was a defiant demo. And we will see some more demos, women of Afghanistan particularly, alongside with their male colleagues. And we will see a new wave of resistance. But unfortunately, we need, unfortunately, we will not see maybe an immediate overthrow, but we need to build an international solidarity. And I know Socialist Alliance always been in the forefront of helping refugees in Afghanistan and internationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farooq, for your observations and your commitment to the ongoing struggle. Yes, I think it is what your comments about the Taliban are very important. I note in Australia there's been some attempts at rehabilitating the Taliban to project that they may perhaps have changed their stripes in some way. That's, of course, been contested. But there isn't a lot of examination of the fact that the United States-led occupation intervention has been courting the Taliban actively, as you say, in the Doha talks, but also beforehand. And that certainly needs to be put under the spotlight. Now, our next guest will be Malik Mir. Malik, thank you for joining us. It's a difficult time probably for you, but we're really happy that you're able to. Malik is a United States-based revolutionary socialist, and he'll be looking at the Joe Biden Democratic government's decision to withdraw and the political fallout and the debate about all this. As I mentioned before, Malik is a regular correspondent for Green Left. So if you'd like to look at more of his writings, you can just click on the Green Left website and check that out. So I'll hand it over to you now, Malik. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have my video set up correctly, but can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Unfortunately, I thought this meeting was tomorrow afternoon, so I was late getting here. But let me just start by saying since August 15th, when the Taliban basically walked into Kabul and the other cities, and the former Prime Minister Ghani fled from the country, events have moved so fast, it's caught not only everyone, obviously, in Afghanistan, but in the U.S. as well, unprepared for the new situation. I would say the most important point to understand is that after 20 years of war and the killing of tens of thousands of Afghan people by the U.S. and its allies, they suffered a major political defeat. I say political defeat because militarily, they didn't have the ability to drive the U.S. military and others out of power, but they did have the ability to win the majority of Afghan people, even those who did not like the Taliban from their previous rule, to turn against the puppet regime. And that to me is one of the most important victories, not only for the people fighting against colonialism in Afghanistan, but around the world, and a big defeat for the U.S. The fallout here is just unfolding because President Biden, the Republicans, Democrats who run the country are bickering over whether this should have happened. But it's clear the ruling class here knew they could not win this war. In fact, I would say they knew this 10 years ago, or at least 10 years ago. And they just continued on knowing that the only way to protect their interests was just to continue to bomb people and just keep a military force there. But the price was too high, and they made that decision. Now, even with the suicide bombings yesterday or Thursday in Kabul airport, the response in the U.S., while on the one hand people are upset, they know that there's no winning strategy to go back into Afghanistan with troops. So what they did today was strike. They launched what they call a retaliation and killed one individual. They said it was ISIS. Who knows if that's true? But that's what they did. Now, the debate here is still unfolding because it has broader ramifications than just Afghanistan. It impacts the rest of the U.S. policy in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, even though they deny it. But it's clear that not only do other jihadists see it as a defeat, but other people who disagree with U.S. policy or British policy see this as an opportunity to strengthen their hand. Now, one of the things that I think is important for those of us who've always opposed the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan and in other countries to recognize is that it's important at this time to keep the pressure on any type of intervention or further intervention into Afghanistan. The first thing the U.S. did and the World Bank and the IMF did was to cut off all funds. And that's considering that Afghanistan depended on a foreign aid and money, you're talking about up to $10 billion that was suddenly cut off. $7 billion from the U.S. alone, $5 billion from the IMF, or $3 billion from the IMF and World Bank and other aid. So there's a problem with the drought in Afghanistan and many other issues that you have 14, maybe 20 million people who are hungry today. So that there's a big catastrophe. And one of the things the U.S. will probably do after Tuesday, the 31st, when they leave, I think the British, the Australians, and everyone else are leaving by tomorrow. But when the U.S. leaves the airport, they're going to maintain these economic sanctions. They're going to continue bombing like they did today, and they're just going to make the thing worse. Now, whatever happens inside Afghanistan politically, and that's unclear. The Taliban is the strongest force, but there are other political actors, other political forces. I'm not talking just about ISIS or Al Qaeda. There are other people who are obviously organizing and have their own interests. The imperialism will continue to put this kind of pressure on the people, which will affect not just the Taliban, but rural areas, peasants, workers, women who they like to pretend to support, and other people. So one of the demands that can be made I think is very important is that these economic sanctions be lifted, and that the money be turned over to whatever government is established. Aid continue to flow into Afghanistan, especially for the on-the-ground organizations whether it's the UN or others, that make sure people are fed, and support whatever other methods that will help the people. That must be done and is important. Now, the other point I wanted to make is that about the U.S. approach, and this has big ramifications too. The U.S. policy didn't begin, in the last year. Or there's a lot of debate here that Donald Trump, the former president, initiated this a year ago in February with the Taliban, and that he was going to withdraw, and Biden was upholding it. The reality is that the U.S., as I said, couldn't win this war militarily, and that's been known for more than 10 years. The significance of this is that to understand this policy and why its defeat is so important, because it originated in 9/11/2001, after that attack in New York. The U.S. made a shift in its fight against what they call terrorists when they established a new program or new security state apparatus to fight what they call the war on terror. Now, the war on terror was never about Al Qaeda. It was never about bin Laden, and it definitely wasn't about the Taliban. The war on terror was the new way for the imperial rulers of the U.S. and its allies to go after anyone they considered a threat to their interests, especially in the Middle East, South Asia, Asia as a whole, which is why the strategy evolved from sending troops to Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria to the biggest bombing campaign in all these countries that continue to this day, where they don't even have bases, like in North Africa. So that was the war on terror, which is not let up. That is the debate here. Is the war on terror cannot be let up? We need to continue going after what they call terrorists. Even though it failed to work in Afghanistan, didn't work really in Iraq or Syria, but that is how they look at it. And it's likely they will add more resources to it. But the reality is the U.S. empire is really in decline, because just bombing people and killing people you call terrorists has only showed your weakness, because they know the American people can only sustain occupations of 100,000 troops for so long. So the strategy has always been, let's use special forces and bombs. That didn't work. And in Afghanistan, which did not have the military weapon, didn't have an air force, didn't have any of that, was able to sustain a 20-year struggle and weaken the American occupiers and eventually win. And I think others around the Middle East and other places see that. And that's very important. Now, how it will unfold, we don't know. I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. But one thing for sure, inside Afghanistan, the next period, there will be some political conflict. There will be some new struggles. And for anyone to say they know what will happen, that would be a mistake. The other point that should be known, recognized, is that it's a mistake to look at this as though Afghanistan is like 20 years ago, which is something that the media here talks about all the time. Afghanistan, the Taliban even, is not the same group as it was 20 years ago. I mean, it has the same vision. Its idea of Islam is the same it had then, but 20 years is a long time. They have a lot more sophisticated people who've joined. Clearly, there were many Taliban people in government, in the military, and the police, and universities who worked in different urban areas, definitely in Kabul. Many things I've read and seen and heard interviews, there were a lot of people who worked inside Kabul who were pro-Taliban and against the U.S. war effort. So we'll see what happens with that, what type of government they form, how they respond to attacks. Fundamentally, in my view, the Taliban is a nationalist organization, even with its religious views. Afghan nationalist group. It never agreed with ISIS, even at its heyday when it was in Syria and Iraq. It was friendly to Al Qaeda because on the question of Islam, they both agree that all Muslims should, function peacefully together, where ISIS wants to kill all non-Sunnis or anyone who doesn't agree with them. So the Taliban, we'll see. And we'll see how the debate unfolds inside the country. But outside the country, definitely here in the U.S., the main job is to put pressure on the government, in our case, the U.S. government, to end its economic sanctions, provide money to those who need it, to help others who are hungry, and not do what it normally does, as it's done to Venezuela, Cuba, and other countries, embargoes. So demand that not happen, and separate the discussion about what the Taliban is or isn't, to the fact that you have to defend all Afghan people right now. And I think that is an important fight. And there are many people on the progressive left in this country who do understand that and do see that as an important point, whatever they think about the Taliban or different groups inside Afghanistan. So that will be, an ongoing fight. I do believe they will leave the U.S. by August 31st. I do believe they're going to continue their war on terror, but it's going to be in a different form. And the next phase of the struggle is what I just said. I think from those of us outside of that area need to make sure that people get the help and so on. Now, one final point on the refugees. Now, of course, the refugees, people who want to leave should be allowed to leave, especially activists like women for women's rights if they want to leave, and others. Many people will not leave, not just those who can't leave, because they will try to, see how they can function in that environment. So yes, they need to get those who want to leave should be able to leave, and they should be able to settle. That's another fight in the U.S. The right wing in this country does not like immigrants, and they don't want them in the country. But the Biden administration says they'll bring in at least 50,000 Afghans inside. So that's important, another important demand. Though I think it's important to recognize that I think 95% are, but I think the 5 to 10% of people who they call translators were really collaborators. And no one wants to talk about that, but it's true. A collaborator were people out there with the military, U.S., British military, pointing out civilians and others and saying, oh, yeah, that's the Taliban. And many people were killed. And that is, they didn't just sit there and translate. They were actually there to help the military carry out their so-called war against the Taliban and against other groups. Now, they will get out, and many of them are, but I think it's important for people on the left, especially, to recognize that distinction, because people who collaborated with occupiers, in my book, are not friends of that we should support. But they will be the ones they will get out. The others do have a right to get out, and I think groups doing that should be strongly supported. Anyhow, so those are some of the points I'll make. I have some others, but I'll take it up in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Malik. Yeah, that's good to have a bit of a feel of how it's playing out in the US. And yes, we'll have more time for discussion. It is, I think you're right about the war on terror is going to be sort of reframed and pushed differently. I guess you could say in some senses the Australian government here is reframing the war on terror all around the question of demonising refugees. So we'll go on to the next speaker, who is Riz Wakil, who is a former refugee from Afghanistan, who arrived in Australia by boat in 1999. Now, Australia had a draconian policy back then, but it has got worse. And I think Sue will speak a bit more about that. But Riz was 19 at the time and spent 7 months or 9 months in Curtin Detention Centre until he was finally accepted as a Hazara refugee. Riz has also organised with Hazaras here in Australia. And I'll hand it over to you, Riz, now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pip. Since the Taliban takeover from the 15th of August. I think I should ask if everyone can hear me properly.
Yes, all good.
Okay. I think one of the biggest misinformation that we all are seeing, that Taliban somehow has changed, and they are allowing people to protest. There are some, images with the international journalists, selfies showing the Taliban are allowing them. But I think the situation on the ground is completely opposite. Most of us here today will know that and have come across some footages and news articles from the activists on the ground in Afghanistan that that will prove that the situation is not as the international media and the leaving or the running away American forces want us to believe. Because I have relatives still in Afghanistan, in Kabul, in central Afghanistan, I'm in touch with a couple other social workers in Afghanistan, people who were there for some kind of humanitarian projects from Australia. They show a completely different picture. As soon as they entered central Afghanistan around Mazar-e-Sharif, they killed innocent women who were just doing their everyday job around the house. They killed, there is a report by Amnesty International that they killed 11 unarmed Hazaras around Mazar-e-Sharif as well. There is a footage available widely in the mainstream media that a guy was from Adelaide who was there to visit his family, was beaten, he's bleeding, and we can see all that. A couple of points that Farooq Tariq made, I will try to put my view on some of the points as well, that it is very important that we have to understand the power players and their role in Afghanistan right now. The Pakistani military establishment, we all know that they are the creator of Taliban in 1992, when Pakistan was Pakistani Prime Minister was Benazir Bhutto, and the Foreign Minister was I think it was Nasrullah Babar. They created Taliban, and their first operation was to secure the hundreds of containers sent by Pakistan as a solidarity and as a good gesture to the Central Asian countries of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and so on. One thing is very important to understand, that the majority of not only Pakistani military establishment and the political establishment, majority of Pakistani population even consider Afghanistan as their territory, as their sixth province. And that hasn't gone away. A lot of Pakistani journalists, and some of them very well-known journalists, are trying to portray Taliban as a changed and as a very well-educated force in Afghanistan, which is not true. And it shouldn't be very difficult for us to understand that a lot of these people, while on one hand they consider Taliban as a very well-educated and changed force who will not try to impose the strict Islamic rule or Sharia law that they were pursuing 20 years ago. And on the other hand, Pakistani Talibans are terrorists for them. So it's not very difficult to understand the mindset of majority of people in Pakistan, military establishment in Pakistan civil society. And on the other hand, I think a lot of people, especially from my community, for them it's very surprising how come Iran is supporting Taliban at this stage. Again, it's not for us, for progressive people, it's not hard to understand that Iran itself is Islamic State, and they do almost similar things that Saudi Arabia stands for. They do almost similar things that the Taliban themselves stands for. So for me as a refugee from Afghanistan, the most important thing will be to find a way to force our government, I'm in Australia at the moment, to help people leave Afghanistan, whoever wants to leave, not only the elite class, not only people who went for a business venture in Afghanistan who wants to return back to their life in the West, but every single ordinary Afghan whose life is now in danger under Taliban government. We have to make sure that we have to push our government to increase their effort and bring as many people to safety as they can. I think at the moment all the region power players in the region, such as Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, I think they're facing a completely different scenario as well, politically and economically. That's my personal view. Anyway, I personally think that Pakistan would like to have a government which will follow their instructions, which will secure their financial and geographical interest, as well as China as well, because China has invested huge amount of money as their Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan, and trying to extend that through Afghanistan and into the Central Asian countries as well. And with that situation, I think we won't see any kind of different approach from the Pakistani military establishment or Pakistani government towards Afghanistan. They will try to support the so-called good Taliban in Afghanistan to secure, of course, to secure their own interest. But at the moment, I think there are influx of refugees, as far as I know, in Quetta, mainly being Hazaras leaving central part of Afghanistan. There are announcements, and I think I can understand why they're trying to keep all this as a low profile and don't give it too much exposure, because again, it might jeopardize their effort to help as many refugees or people who are fleeing across the border into that part of Pakistan. They are announcing in mosques, asking people to help the newly arrived refugees in Quetta. They're trying to accommodate them. And I think we should do a lot more sitting in safety in countries like Australia, European countries, America as well. I think we have to force our government, we have to do whatever it takes to force our government to help these people who wants to leave Afghanistan and start a new life of safety and freedom anywhere else. I don't think it's very easy, considering my own experience as a refugee in Australia. Australian government is one of the I say when it comes, Australian government is very brutal when it comes to treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. People are still locked up in remote camps outside of Australia. Australia doesn't want to help them. It will be a very difficult and time-consuming task for us, and it feels like it's never ending. Sometimes we think that we have succeeded and we achieved something, but several years later we find ourselves exactly in the same spot that we were 15, 20 years ago. People are thinking, even inside Afghanistan, that people are hopeful that situation might not be as bad as it was under the Taliban rule before the 9/11. I personally don't think that. We can differentiate between ISIS and Taliban. They are just two different sides of the same page. And time will only prove that Taliban hasn't changed, because they're just at the moment they're just trying to strengthen their grip on the power, and once they have full control over resources and over the government in Afghanistan, I don't see any reason why they will change their approach, fundamentalist approach towards the society and towards everyone else in Afghanistan. And I personally hope that progressive forces outside Afghanistan will always stand by people in Afghanistan who were left helpless by the Western occupying forces, who didn't have any plan for them, for a stronger Afghanistan, for a stronger democratic government in Afghanistan, and just fled in the middle of the night and left people in the mercy of these barbaric and fundamentalist people that whoever wants to call them whatever, Taliban or ISIS. And let's hope that we can do something for people who are suffering under this regime.
Thank you, Riz. Yes, very sobering, your comments there. I guess without further ado, I'll go straight to Sue Bolton, who's our final panelist this evening. She is a long-term campaigner, and she's a member of the National Executive of the Socialist Alliance. She's a 3-term councillor in Moreland in Victoria, in north-west of Melbourne. And Sue's been very active in the refugee rights campaigns, movements for many decades now. And as well, she was, of course, still campaigning against racism and was very involved in the struggle against the war in Afghanistan before it started. So over to you, Sue. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks especially to all the international guests, and also to Riz, and also everyone who's participating in the discussion today. There'll be time for everyone to have their say in a moment after I've finished. So I'll be talking a bit more from the Australian perspective. And from the very beginning, the Australian government was fully on board with the US so-called war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, and then the invasion of Iraq. And it was bipartisan support. The Liberal Party and the Labor Party, when both were in government, have both continued the occupation. It was started by the Liberal Party, but continued under successive governments. And in order to win enough public support for both the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, the US and the Australian government had to use humanitarian arguments to disguise their real purpose. I remember that just before the US invasion of Afghanistan, there was a march by victims of the collapse of the Twin Towers saying, "Not in my name," that they did not support the invasion of Afghanistan in the name of their family members who died in the Twin Towers. Now, that was never reported in the mainstream media in Australia, and I think I heard somewhere that it was only reported in the left and left and maybe smaller liberal media in the US. However, the anti-war movement in opposition to the invasion of Afghanistan was quite small in comparison to the massive anti-war movement against the invasion of Iraq. A large section of the Australian public did buy the line that the invasion was necessary to stop future terror attacks and to save the Afghan people, in particular women, from the Taliban. The fact that Osama bin Laden had been funded and armed by the US for decades was mentioned but not highlighted by the mainstream media in case it got in the way of the humanitarian justification for the war. Socialist Alliance members were actively involved along with other left and anti-war activists to oppose the invasion. When feminist and left activists from Afghanistan, Malalai Joya, came to Australia, I think around 10 or 12 years ago, many people who accepted the line about the humanitarian invasion were confused when Malalai said that the people of Afghanistan had two enemies, the Taliban and the US. Many people who had accepted that the invasion was to rescue women or, produce democracy in Afghanistan, assumed that Malalai would only be talking against the Taliban and not against the US occupation. What Malalai said in her argumentation was that the people of Afghanistan only want to fight one enemy and not two enemies. Therefore, she wanted one of the enemies, that is the US, to leave so that people could could fight against the Taliban. Recently, Malalai did an interview with a German paper where she said that the American and Western troops have failed. They've come for their own geopolitical interests, from their own domestic interests, that they are now leaving. The Americans replaced the barbaric regime of the Taliban with the brutal warlords and then began to negotiate with the Taliban, even though the nature of the Taliban has never changed. And I think one thing which is really rarely ever mentioned in the mainstream media is that the puppet government that was set up by the United States in Afghanistan was a government of the warlords. And that's really rarely ever mentioned. It's sort of, it's really described as if it was a genuine sort of government, democratic government. Many people have been surprised by how quickly the Afghan puppet government and army collapsed so quickly. But really, we shouldn't be surprised. The US occupation forces, including Australia, bombed, occupied, terrorized, and carried out terrible atrocities and didn't even bother to count the Afghan casualties. The invaders imposed a series of puppet governments composed of brutal and corrupt warlords. If there was popular support for the Afghan government, it wouldn't have melted away as fast as it did. And I think really the brutality of the US occupation, in particular the drone attacks, were probably the best recruiting agency for the Taliban. And I think even Afghan people who might have gained some benefits from the occupation, such as jobs or education, also experienced the fear and horror of indiscriminate drone attacks. While the war was sold as a good war in Australia and the US and other places, it was never a good war. There were some interesting comments also made recently by an Afghan army commander who said that while the Afghan army is not without blame, the forces ultimately responsible were the political leaders in Afghanistan and the United States. And he mentioned three specific factors that led to the Afghan army's collapse. The peace deal that Trump signed with the Taliban, the loss of contractor logistics and maintenance support in Afghanistan, and the corruption epidemic in Ghani's government. And he said that just on the military front, which just, shows how pathetic all of the US excuses are. He said that when the US just left the Bagram Air Base on the 5th of July without even telling the Afghan army, because they didn't give a shit, basically. They took with them all the software and weapons systems that were required to operate a lot of the key military technology that the Afghan army had been given by the US. So, I mean, I guess it's like, imperialism all over the world, where you might get a few little crumbs, but, basically you don't get what's required. While there might be some support for the Taliban, there doesn't appear to have been any popular uprising in support of the Taliban, but it seems to be more an acquiescence that the Taliban takeover was inevitable, and then multiple warlords just simply swapped sides. But it has been really pleasing to see that there have been protests that have broken out against the Taliban takeover, and that is really pleasing to see that there is resistance, because that is absolutely critically important to the next stage. I also think one of the things which has often been overlooked is that the occupation also really artificially changed the balance of forces and built up some warlords to be extra powerful. For example, in Uruzgan province, where the Australian military was, the local warlord in that province was really built up from being a minor warlord to being a very powerful warlord as a result of their alliance with the Australian military. And that happened in every province where the occupying armies were. In fact, in Uruzgan province, sometimes this particular warlord would tell the Australian military that such and such a person was Taliban, and the Australian military would trot off and kill them. But sometimes they were just simply business rivals or people he owed money to. So there's no doubt that the US has been defeated, but is it the end of the US's military attacks on other countries? And I suspect not. I mean, one of Biden's recent comments was that that they have a national strategy in the aftermath of the pulling out of troops from Afghanistan to monitor, disrupt significant terrorist threats, not only in Afghanistan, but anywhere they may arise, whether they're in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Where will the US train its guns next? Latin American countries like Venezuela, China, or somewhere else? I think we can't be relaxed about this, and we need to oppose the US attempts to expand their military bases across the world. And they are still in an expansionist phase in terms of their military bases. And then another key demand that we also need to make, along with war reparations. I mean, there needs to be a repaying of money to Afghanistan for rebuilding and humanitarian aid, etc. But there also needs to be a bringing of war criminals to justice. And in Australia, there was a report released in 2020 which outlined horrific revelations of war crimes by the Australian military. And the Australian Federal Police are looking at laying charges against some members of Australia's military forces. However, they're not looking at any of the big wigs, the big commanders, or the political leaders responsible for the war. They're really looking at lower down soldiers who've carried out really unspeakable atrocities. However, some of the war crimes trials that may happen in Australia are probably in jeopardy because of the Taliban takeover. And, because there has been a systematic military cover-up of war crimes over the whole period of the occupation. And some of the war crimes have been really quite horrific, such as, shooting and killing a prisoner because they didn't fit on the helicopter that was removing prisoners from a particular location. Another occasion of kicking an unarmed farmer over the edge of a cliff and then just killing him when he fell to the bottom and didn't die in the fall. Another occasion when they accidentally killed a farmer in a field and then decided to kill all of the other 10 farmers so that there were no witnesses to be left alive. The witness for that had her home bombed, firebombed in November in Sydney or somewhere in Australia. And the witnesses to all of these atrocities have been intimidated and threatened. And no doubt those atrocities really did build into the Taliban taking back control of Afghanistan. And we need to keep pursuing, bring the war criminals to account. I think one of the critical things in Australia that we need to do is to break the ANZUS Treaty, which was used to justify the invasion of Afghanistan. And the ANZUS Treaty is a military treaty dating back to 1951 of Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and has been invoked in many interventions. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Malaysia, and other places as well. And we need to push for an end to this military alliance and to close all US military bases in Australia. And this, Australia hitching its wagon to the United States military also means that, Australia is a willing participant in this, as our own capitalist class, but it also, drags us off to war. Has been used to try and strengthen the attacks on China in around the Spratly Islands. No doubt China has done bad things as well, but it's just totally hypocritical given what Australia has done in the East Timor Sea against the Timorese. So it's a reactionary military treaty which needs to be broken. So just on the last couple of points, I'm not sure how I'm going for time. The US occupation ended in such a chaotic way because the US never really cared about Afghan people. They never cared what happened after it left. They just wanted, they decided at a certain point to exit, and, they didn't care what happened. And the same with Australia. And it seems that not one single occupying army intended to lift the little finger to rescue people who would be targeted by the Taliban from Afghanistan before they left. So instead, they waited until after the Taliban took over before trying to rescue anyone who might have been targeted by the Taliban. In fact, the US even left its massive Bagram air base on the 5th of July without even telling the Afghan army that was meant to take over that airbase. And, Biden, Scott Morrison in Australia claimed that they didn't know that the Taliban was going to take over. I mean, we can see all the media reports. We didn't even need the military reports. We just saw the media reports that the Taliban was taking over province after province as warlords jumped ship and shifted allegiance. So it was clear what was going to happen. But some people who had worked for the Australian government, either as interpreters or doing security at the embassy or whatever, some of those people had put in refugee applications in 2013, 7, 10, 9, 8, 5 years ago, and the Australian government has simply not processed them. So it's absolutely, the Morrison government, the US government absolutely didn't give a stuff about the Afghan people. But I think the Australian government's response has been even worse, because out of all the occupying powers, the Australian government has the most barbaric refugee policy out of all of the occupying powers, even more barbaric than the United States, and that's saying something. The Australian government has been insisting that they will only take Afghan refugees if they apply within the country, which means that if some Afghan people manage to escape to Pakistan or Iran or further north to Uzbekistan, the Australian government will not accept them. So this is something which has to change, and it's something that in Australia we have to keep building the movement to force the Australian government to take refugees from outside of Afghanistan as well as inside Afghanistan, and that includes lifting the ban on accepting Afghan and all other refugees from Indonesia. These are all refugees who've been recognised as refugees by the UNHCR, but the Australian government has banned from coming to Australia since 2014. The other thing which the Australian media and Australian politicians haven't been talking about is the fact that there are thousands of Afghan refugees in Australia, especially from the Hazara community, who haven't been allowed to see their families or be reunited with their families for up to 10 years. And this is because the Australian government has had a policy where refugees who arrived before 2013, who were recognised as refugees and granted permanent protection visas, have been forced to the bottom of the queue for family reunion, which basically means if they arrived here by boat. This was a Tony Abbott, Scott Morrison initiative. So this means that basically those refugees have been banned from ever being reunited with their families. Then refugees who arrived in Australia by boat after 2013, who've been recognised as refugees, have been put on temporary protection visas or SHEV visas, which means they have to renew them every 3 years or 5 years. And it basically bans them also from family reunion. And in recent times, the Australian government has decided to stop renewing these visas. So put people on bridging visas pending deportation from Australia to Afghanistan. So this is cruel on so many, many levels. And so in the refugee movement, we are campaigning for the Australian government to increase its humanitarian intake of refugees from Afghanistan by 20,000 places, like what the Canadian government is doing. And we're also calling for all of Afghan refugees and asylum seekers to be released from detention and granted permanent protection visas. And for those on temporary protection visas or bridging visas to have those visas converted to permanent protection visas, and the ban on family reunion to be lifted. So these are all components of what the refugee movement is calling for in Australia. And it's really important that we use the horror that people are feeling about the failure of the Australian government to rescue the families of Afghan asylum seekers, use this horror to try and build a stronger refugee movement which can win these demands, not only for Afghan refugees, but all refugees, whether they're Rohingya refugees or Tamil refugees or, whatever horrific conditions people come from. So I'll just leave it there because we want to have lots of time for discussion and questions from everyone who's online. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue.
Thanks again, everybody, for joining this live stream forum. Sorry about the technical difficulties. If you do like our work, please become a supporter, and we will see you at the next time.